Okay. Let me just begin by acknowledging our sponsors. This series is sponsored by Jennifer and David Miller, commemorating the yahrzeit of Schrier Salah Shalom and the merit of a refuah for Chava Basdalia Hinda, Sheva Refuah Shalema. And this particular shiur is also co-sponsored by Hedy and Jay Richmond in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Chaim Feigenbaum, Chaim Yisachar ben Yechiel Zedel Dov, Zichrono Livracha. Every year, we, in advance of Matan Torah, Zman Matan Torah Seinu, in advance of Shavuos, we explore one of our Aseret HaDibrot, and insofar as this is the third installment of this annual series. This year, we are going to explore the third of the 10 Commandments, Lo Tisah Hashem Hashem Elokecha Lashav. And the particular question that we're going to explore tonight is why this is included as one of the 10 Commandments. If many of us were tasked with constructing the 10 Commandments, with constructing the Aseret HaDibrot, there are many of them that would be rather intuitive choices. I think a natural starting point is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. The declaration of monotheism is probably a pretty intuitive starting point. Lo Tirtzach, not to kill, which is a pretty egregious crime in the Bein Adam Lachavero realm, in the interpersonal realm, is a pretty intuitive choice also. There may be other choices that we wouldn't have made intuitively, but once they're there, we can certainly understand them. Shabbos is pretty important to who we are. It might not have been again, if you're constructing a list, I could have seen somebody including other things, but once it's there, it doesn't really bother us very much. Honoring parents, there are lots of them that really intuitively and naturally fit into the Aseret HaDibrot. I think the one that is probably most challenging in terms of the Aseret HaDibrot is Lo Tisah Hashem Hashem Elokecha Lashav. Why is using the Lord's name in vain considered such a heinous crime that it's included in those 10 principles? We often call them 10 commandments. It's a bit of a misnomer. The Aseret HaDibrot include far more than 10 commandments. Each commandment often includes several mitzvos, or many of them include more than one mitzvah. But why is this one included in this illustrious list of 10? And that's a fair question that many raise, and even just in a cultural context. Monty Python poked fun at one point, declaring the Lord's name in vain for that reason. It's really, again, a natural question that one asks when reading the Aseret HaDibrot and seeing this as the third installment in the Aseret HaDibrot. And that's really what I want to try to explore tonight. Now, before we explore it, let me just make a point that is a subtle point, but I think it's an important one. When I try to justify why this is among the Aseret HaDibrot, I am not doing so in contrast to other mitzvahs. I'm not aiming to tell you why I think this was chosen over 603 other mitzvahs that could have been chosen. Had other mitzvahs been chosen that are not part of the 10, we could have made a case for why those are so important as well. So my question is not why this over other mitzvahs. My question is, now that Hashem has included this in the Aseret HaDibrot, what are we supposed to take from that? What are we supposed to derive from it? Now, again, the distinction between those questions is a subtle one, but to me, it's an important one. I'll make the case for why Lo Tisah, and I can see someone walking out saying, Rabbi, very nice. You could have made the case for a lot of different mitzvahs. And I'm openly acknowledging at the outset, that is likely true. If there were others that were part of the Aseret HaDibrot, every mitzvah has immense value, and there certainly would have been something to derive from the fact that Hashem decided to include those alternatives in the Aseret HaDibrot. So I'm not looking to downgrade any other mitzvahs, chas v'shalom. What I'm trying to explain instead is, now that it is included, and it's not an intuitive choice, what is exactly the message that is trying to be conveyed, and what are we supposed to take from it? And that's what we're going to explore tonight. As always, as we've kind of done over the last 3 years, the first installment of this series is always more halachic in nature, and the following two, I guess, are more hashkafic and practical, and we'll circle back to those. Obviously, they're all interrelated, but let's try to establish the foundations by looking at some of the halachic questions, and in particular, why it's included. And you'll see that I want to do so in a bit of an oblique or indirect way. Rather than looking just at Lo Tisah Hashem Hashem Elokecha Lashav, we're going to look at a parallel mitzvah that in some ways, as we will see, is the opposite side of the same coin. And hopefully that will give us some perspective on what exactly this mitzvah is truly all about, beyond just uttering Hashem's name. So we'll start with the most basic source text, the psukim in the Torah itself, in the Aseret HaDibrot, that describe this mitzvah. Source number 1 is Parshas Yisro. Lo Tisah Hashem Hashem Elokecha Lashav, ki lo yenakeh Hashem eis asher yisah Hashem Lashav. Do not take the Lord's name in vain, because Hashem will not cleanse for those who take the Lord's name in vain. Ki lo yenakeh. So you already see in the pasuk itself, you have not just the command, but also a statement about how severe it is. And we're going to see that the Gemara picks up on this. Ki lo yenakeh Hashem eis asher yisah Hashem Lashav. The statement that Hashem will not cleanse for it, and we know that in general, we have a process of teshuvah through which we can cleanse any iniquity or sin that we have committed. the fact that here it's let's say at least harder to do so, as is evident from the psukim, is already not just a statement of the inclusion in the Aseret HaDibros, but the Torah already hones into the fact that this is severe. Don't take it lightly. Don't think it's something small or trivial or insignificant. It is quite significant. And we have the same thing in Devarim Parakeh Pasuk Yud Aleph. That's Parshas Va'eschanan, where the second account of the Aseret HaDibros. It's literally the same exact pasuk. Lo yisa Hashem Hashem lakach lashav ki lo yinakeh Hashem eis asher yisa eshemo lashav. So it's really the same pasuk in both instances. The only reason why I quote it twice is because that's not always the case by the Aseret HaDibros. There are differences and subtle differences in formulation between the two Aseret HaDibros, the most famous of which is Zachor v'Shamor in the context of Shabbos. Please God, next year when we get to the fourth of the Aseret HaDibros, maybe we'll take a look at that. That's not the only difference. There are other differences as well. When it comes to Lo Sisa, we have the exact same pasuk in both places. Now, what I want to do tonight is put these psukim in the Aseret HaDibros in tension with another pasuk that we have in Sefer Devarim. Another pretty famous pasuk, and certainly an inspiring pasuk, like so many of the psukim in Sefer Devarim. In source number 3, you'll see Devarim Parak Yud Pasuk Chaf, which declares as follows: Hashem Elokecha Tira, fear Hashem, Oso Sa'avod, serve Hashem, Uvozid Bak, cling to Hashem, and finally, Uvishmo Tishavei, and swear in the name of Hashem. So we have two psukim in sources 1 and 2 in the Aseret HaDibros, telling us, do not take the Lord's name in vain. And we have another pasuk, seemingly, if you just read the pasuk at face value, commanding you to swear in the name of Hashem. Now, are those contradictory? No, they're not contradictory. If the prohibition is Lo Sisa Hashem Elokecha Lashav, taking the Lord's name in vain, then Uvishmo Tishaveya, on a most intuitive level, would mean that when it's not in vain, whatever those circumstances may be, and we're not going to explore that now, but there are a whole host of circumstances in which a shvuah is warranted. There are different instances of shvuas adayanin and shvuas aidos. All of Masechah Shavuos talks about the different instances in which it is warranted. But on a most basic level, you'd say, okay, taking the Lord's name in vain, really, really bad. Again, not just bad, really bad. But when it's done in a proper context, it's okay. And yet, if you look in the Gemara, in several instances, we find that the Gemara does kind of see, again, no contradiction between these psukim, but indeed a measure of tension between them. Let's take a look at sources 4, 5, and 6. Amar Rav Idi bar Abin, Amar Rav Amram. Rav Idi bar Abin reports in the name of Rav Amram, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav Yochanan, Mishum Yossi Aglili. So we have a long list of names, Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yochanan, Rav Yossi Aglili. Ultimately, it traces back to Rav Yossi Aglili. He taught the following teaching. Kol lo sa'asher shabatorah, when it comes to any prohibition in the Torah, Azabo Maisa, if you actively violated, second line of source number 4, loke, then you receive punishment in basin, corporal punishment in basin. Lo Azabo Maisa, patur. But if you didn't do anything, you passively violated, you are exempt. This is a principle that, a very important principle, that exists in halacha called lav sheyesh ba maisa. If you violate actively, then there's punishment. If you violate passively, there's no punishment. To give just one example, that is actually a rather controversial example, but it just highlights the point clearly. And insofar as we're in Sfiras HaOmer right now, coming out of Pesach, it still is, I guess, in the recesses of our memory, of our mind. The Rambam talks about owning chametz on Pesach, which is a prohibition. Ba'ira, ba'imatzah, it's perhaps 2 prohibitions. The Rambam counts it as 2, which is also a topic unto itself. But you violated something if you own chametz on Pesach. The Rambam says as follows: if you bought chametz before Pesach and you, let's say, forgot about it, or let's say you didn't even forget about it, you deliberately did not sell it before Pesach, you wanted to own that chametz on Pesach, and you kept the chametz on Pesach, you do not receive any corporal punishment in Beis Din. Why? You didn't do anything. It was purchased in Cheshvan. You purchased it a while before, and you kind of just left it in your possession, which is a passive violation of the prohibition. However, the Rambam says, if on Kol Hamoed Pesach, you go to the store and you buy yourself a loaf of bread, the Rambam says you are liable. Why? Because in that circumstance, you did do an activity. You picked yourself up, you got in the car, you went to the store, you made the purchase, and because you did an activity in the context of the Aveira, you do receive punishment. Now, again, is that an obvious example? It is certainly not, but it does illustrate the point. Ordinarily speaking, you don't receive punishment unless you do something. But the Gemara says there is an exception. So we are in the second line of source number 4, after the second dash there. After the semicolon. There are certain instances where you do a rather egregious sin, and you are punished for it. What are they? Nishba, Meimir, Mekalel. Mekalel is actually, this past week's parsha, we saw that one who blasphemes, who curses this Chaver of Hashem. who curses with the name of Hashem, or again, one of the instances is Nishba, you took a Shavua, presumably a Shavua Shav, again, an unnecessary Shavua. In that instance, even though you didn't do an activity, you are punished for it. Then after the ellipsis, the Gemara says something shocking. Amar, third line of source number 4, Amar afilu Shavuas emes. Maybe even if you take a true oath, you're not lying, you're not taking a frivolous oath. It is an oath that's either mandated or at least appropriate, but you do it with the name of Hashem, maybe the Gemara suggests you should be punished for doing so. The Gemara says, you can't tell me that there are psukim that say explicitly that in instances of conflict, let's say monetary conflict, there are instances where a person should take a shvuah, where they should take an oath. The Gemara says, maybe what happens is it's a scenario where you did that, you took a shvuah in order to try to get out of a dispute, but you acted inappropriately and you should still receive malchus. The Gemara here is again seriously considering the possibility that even for a truthful oath, you should receive malchus. And the Gemara concludes in the final line, Lo matzis amris dehachsiv uvishmo tishaveh. That can't be the case because we have the pasuk that we saw in source number 3, uvishmo tishaveh, telling you to swear in the name of Hashem. So don't tell me that you receive malchus, that there's corporal punishment for a case where you take a truthful and warranted oath. So you see already in the Gemara that again, there is something of a tension between our deep reticence to take a shvuah on the one hand, and this word v'shmo tishaveh, which licenses us in certain circumstances to do so as well. See a similar idea in the Medrash Tanchuma. Source number 5. Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael. God speaks to the Bnei Yisrael and he says, Lo tiyu svurim shemutar lachem lishava b'shmi. Don't think that you're allowed, that you're licensed to take a shvuah, to take an oath in my name. Afilu be'emes ein atem risha'in l'shava b'shmi. Even if you are taking a truthful oath, again, it's very similar in spirit, thematically similar to the Gemara that we just saw in source number 4, the Gemara in Temura. You're not allowed to take an oath in my name. Ella, second line, and here are the prerequisites, says the Medrash, for taking a shvuah in the name of Hashem. And what does it quote? It quotes all of the beginning of the pasuk in source number 3. As Hashem Elokecha tira, ve'oso sa'avod, u'vosidbak, u'vishmo tishaveya. Once you properly fear Hashem and you serve Him and you cling to Him, then the Medrash is saying, then you can swear in God's name. That's what the Medrash is doing with the pasuk. We're going to come back to this basic observation a little bit later. So, but what does the Medrash do with that? It says final line, because it says as Hashem Elokecha tira, as a prefatory remark to Uvishmo tishaveya, it says you're only allowed, you're only licensed to take that shvuah if you exhibit the great fear of heaven that were exhibited by 3 people who are called in the psukim Yirei Elokim, Abraham, Eov, and Yosef. Abraham, Eov, and Yosef are all described in different contexts as Yirei Elokim. Interesting what to do with those 3 and why those 3 are specifically identified that way. But the Medrash says only once you have their high level of fear of heaven are you licensed to take a shvuah. If you have this, again, this really refined spiritual character, these moral attainments, these spiritual attainments, like these great tzaddikim, then you are licensed to take a shvuah, otherwise you are not. So once again, you have this tension. On the one hand, not wanting to take a shvuah, and the pasuk uvishmo tishaveya licenses you to do so in particular limited circumstances, according to the Medrash Tanchuma, only when you've really attained a very high spiritual level and significantly refined your spiritual character, then you are licensed to do so. And then one final source that really highlights this tension as well. This is probably a more famous source, only because it appears at the beginning of Perek Shavuos Hadayanin, which is a classic Perek that is studied in Masechah Shavuos. Source number 6, Tanu Rabbanan Shavuos Hadayanin Ati B'Lshon Ne'emra. So a Shavuos Hadayanin is, again, well, what a Shavuos Hadayanin is the subject of the entire Perek, but there are certain particular types of oaths that were taken in the context of a rabbinic courtroom, where the Beis Din would mandate a shvuah. And there were different types of Shavuos Hadayanin. That's, again, what the Perek is about. But it says you say it in the proper Lashon, you say it in Lashon HaKod, Avi B'Lshon Ne'emra, Omrim lo have yodea shekola olam kulon mizda'azeya b'shah she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Sinai lo sisa Hashem Hashem Elokecha lashad. But before anyone takes a shvuah, we give him fair warning. And we say, we want you to understand the magnitude of what you are about to undertake. Don't think that this is just, an utterance of your lips that you can do flippantly without a second thought. Recognize that this is a matter of grave spiritual significance. The entire world shook when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said on Har Sinai, Lo sisa Hashem Hashem Elokecha lashav. Now, mind you, again, if they're saying that the entire world shook specifically for the third, this is in the context of the Aseret HaDibrot generally. It's not saying that the world shook for Lo Tirtzach or Lo Tinaf or Lo Tigno, specifically for Lo sisa Hashem Hashem Elokecha lashav, Ki Lo Yinakeh Hashem, as we're going to see in a moment, Eis Asher Yisa Hashem lashav, that at this moment, this is very grave. This was the moment when the entire earth shook, when God declared this proclamation. If you look at the underline, we're not going to read the entire source number 6, but we'll see passages from it. And part of the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, we say that Hashem cleanses us. And here, specifically by this Aveira, we say, Lo Yinakeh. Once again, highlighting this is a very grave and significant spiritual matter. Second underline. Ordinarily speaking, if you sin, you are punished for it. Here, this is so severe that you and your entire family are punished for this sin. And it quotes proof texts from Nach. Third underline. Here, again, it's not going to be extracted just from you, but rather that the punishment is incurred by the entire world. And that's a line that we're going to get back to as well. This whole notion of mishpacha and kol ha'olam, etc. Fourth underline. Ordinarily speaking, if you sin, God will give you time. They'll delay the punishment to give you an opportunity to do teshuvah, to give you an opportunity to try to amend, to correct, and then obviate the need for punishment. In this instance, you're punished immediately. And then if you look at the final underline, second to bottom line of source number 6, the destruction of taking an untruthful oath is worse than the destructive power, or the destructive power is greater than the destructive power of fire and flood. That is the conclusion of the severity. Im amar eini nishba, potrin oso, final line, potrin oso miyad. If the person says, look, I'm hearing what you're saying, this is a very, very grave matter, and I still maintain that I'm right, but I'm not going to undertake this. I'm not going to undertake a Shavuot because it's so grave and it's so severe, and all the things that you just shared with me, I recognize that this is no small matter. I'm just not going to do the Shavuot. Then he's exempt from making the Shavuot. If he says, fine, I'm going to take the Shavuot anyway. I'm telling the truth. I get that it's a severe matter, but I'm telling the truth. I'm telling you what's right. I'm going to take the Shavuot. The people who are there, and they hear this person about to take the Shavuot, what do they say to each other? What do they say? They say, distance yourself from these wicked people. Where is that pasuk from? Parshas Korach. Parshas Korach. Okay, when that is declared about Dasan and Aviram. Dasan and Aviram are described as those Anashim Rishaim Ha'ela. So again, here you have somebody who's taking a Shavuot and they're insisting that it's truthful. And nonetheless, everyone's saying, if you're willing to do that, then there's a problem and we're going to stay away. And again, the particular proof text or the particular reference to Dasan and Aviram is perhaps something that we will come back to as well. So you see that this again, we have this broad sensitivity to Lo Sisa Hashem Hashem Elokecha Lashav, to the Lord's name in vain. It is extraordinarily severe, even though it was not necessarily an intuitive inclusion in the Aseret HaDibrot. And even though we have a pasuk that says that you should take a Shavuot b'Shem Hashem, it's clearly with very, very great hesitation. Perhaps you need to attain an elite spiritual level. Perhaps even if you're right, you shouldn't do so, and the Beis will discourage you from doing so. Even though we have this pasuk that says, swear in the name of Hashem, there's great reticence to actually activate that or to act upon it. That is the background to our discussion tonight. What I want to really focus on is Ubishmo Tishavaya, the circumstances where you have to, perhaps even should, in some instances, take a Shavuot. Because again, as we're going to see, as we already saw from these sources, and we're going to see even more acutely in the opinion of the Rambam, that pasuk is not just in tension with our prohibition of saying the Lord's name in vain, but it is very much related, thematically related to it, and in some ways the opposite side of the same coin. So let's do a brief halachic analysis of those words, Ubishmo Tishavaya. And we're going to start in source number 7 with the Rabbi. And the Rambam in source number 7 is from Sefer HaMitzvos Asay Zayin. It's going to be a source that we examined several times tonight. You could see it quoted at greater length in source number 13. So we're going to come back to it and examine it in greater length. But for now, let's take a look at it in shorthand in source number 7. Says the Rambam, mitzvah hashaviyis. The 7th mitzvah, hi shetzivanu lihishava b'shmo yis'ala kishanistarech l'kayim davar min advarim olah hakrisha. There is a mitzvah, says the Rambam, to swear in the name of Hashem when you need to affirm something or you need to deny something. There are cases in court, you have a monetary dispute, and you need to affirm the truth of assertion X, you need to deny the accusation, that you do not deny the truth of accusation Y, then in those instances, says the Rambam, there is a mitzvah to take a Shavuot. The Ramban, in source number 8, who composed Hasagos, the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, the Ramban had comments on the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos in which he frequently disagrees with the way the Rambam counts. Either he will say that the Rambam counted something, as we'll see in a moment, that should not have been counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Or alternately, he will say the Rambam missed something that should have been counted. Of course, if the Ramban is going to take away some of the 613, he needs to tell you what exactly he's filling it in with. So the Ramban, as in his commentary on the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, will tell you in different instances, this should not have been included, this should have been included, etc., etc. And that's precisely what he does here. Source number 8, the Ramban quotes some of the sources that we were looking at just a moment ago in Chazal. Don't tell me that there's a mitzvah to take a shvuah, there's an obligation to take a shvuah. When the Torah says it's not giving you a command. It's not telling you go swear in God's name. It's telling you that it is sometimes permitted with many conditional provisions, says the Ramban. It is not just, again, something that you could jump into. If there are lots of prerequisites in place, as we saw in the Medrash in source number 5, if you're really, again, in rarefied spiritual air, and it's really a circumstance that requires it, then you are allowed to, you are licensed to. But don't tell me, says the Ramban, that there's a mitzvah to do so. Just look at the Gemara. How can you tell me there's a mitzvah? Because of his, mitzvah el rashus shaloka divrei harav, he says the only way to interpret this is as a permission, as a license, but not as a mitzvah. But the Rambam does count it as a mitzvah. Some of the other monei ha-mitzvos, some of the other counts of the mitzvahs composed by the Rishonim, try to suggest that maybe it is a mitzvah, but not exactly like the Rambam says, that it's like a good thing to do it, but it's good to do it in a certain way. Take a look at sources 9 and 10. We'll start with source number 9, which is the Sefer Mitzvos Katan by the Rimi Korvil, one of the Balei HaTosfos, really the Chasidei Ashkenaz. He says, Lishava Bishmo, the 108th mitzvah is to take a shvuah in the name of Hashem, because the pasuk does say to do that. It's not that you're obligated to take a shvuah in the name of Hashem. He's kind of echoing the critique of the Ramban here, saying it's not that you're obligated to do so. It's a circumstantial mitzvah. In a circumstance where you are going to take a shvuah, do so truthfully. You see how he's trying to thread the needle here between the Rambam and the Ramban's critique. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah. Not comfortable saying it's a mitzvah, like the Ramban pointed out. Doesn't seem like it's a good thing. What it's telling you is when you do it, make sure that what you're saying is truthful. In other words, it's like a sister mitzvah too. Midvar sheker tercha. Don't lie, tell the truth. That's really all this mitzvah is telling you. Sevi Yereim and Rei Samak Zayin, Rabbi Elazar Mimatz, also has a slightly different way of trying to thread this needle. It says, Li'ishava b'Hashem, Tziva Hashem Baruch Hu, Hashem commanded, K'sheyeschayev Adam Shvuah, when a person is obligated to take a shvuah, Shelo yechayvuhu based in Lihishava Ella Bishmo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he should only take a shvuah in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No swearing on one's children, no swearing on one's parents, no swearing on your favorite sports team. There's no swearing on any of those things. When you take a shvuah, you only do so in the name of Hashem. Quotes the pasuk that we read, and then second line after the period, V'tanya es Hashem Elokecha tirav oso savar u'shmoti shavaya ve'emlav eino rasha lihishava b'shmo. He quotes the brisa, or as we saw in the Medrash, that it's a precondition. But the Ram is saying once again, it's not an obligation. When you do it in a particular way. And what is the way in which you should do it? So Sefer Mitzvos Katan says, do so truthfully, okay, rather intuitive. And the Sefer Yereim adds, only do it in the name of Hashem, not in the name of anything less than. And that's how they interpret the mitzvah. If you look in source number 11, the Kinas Sofrim tries to read the Rambam that way as well. But it's certainly not what the Rambam appears to be saying. The Rambam appears to be saying it is a mitzvah. And in light of all the Gemaras that we saw, the Gemaras that the Ramban points out, that seem to discourage one from taking the Shvuah, one needs to wonder why exactly the Rambam counts it. What's more, before we try to answer that problem, is that the Rambam doesn't just count this as a mitzvah. He puts it, if you will, in his top 10 mitzvahs. What do I mean by that? When different Svarim count the 613 mitzvahs, they have to sequence the 613 mitzvahs. Now, I guess the easiest way to sequence the 613 mitzvahs, I shouldn't say easiest because it's really not so easy, but one of the ways in which one can sequence the 613 mitzvahs is by the order in which they appear in the Torah. And that is how which Sefer Mitzvahs is organized? The Sefer HaChinuch, which is part of why the Sefer HaChinuch is so popular. The Sefer HaChinuch is largely based on the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, but it's organized according to the Parshios. So the first mitzvah in the Torah is Pru Urvu, because that's already given to Adam HaRishon and Parshas Bereshis. And the second mitzvah is Bris Milah, because that's given to Avraham Avinu. And then Gid HaNashem, because that comes up by Yaakov. And then all the mitzvahs of Sefer Shemos, HaChodesh HaLachem, etc., etc. All the mitzvahs of Sefer Shemos. So it's organized by the Parshios. And again, so it's sometimes you have to determine, and this is always interesting in the Sefer HaChinuch, when you have a pasuk that appears in multiple places, which one is the primary source text for the mitzvah, which one is secondary, where exactly do you count it? That's why it's not always such an easy endeavor, but that's how he organizes. The Rambam doesn't do it that way. First of all, the Rambam gives you separate counts for the mitzvahs aseh and the mitzvahs lo aseh. So first he gives you 248 mitzvahs aseh, 365 mitzvahs lo aseh. Number two, he doesn't sequence according to where they appear in the Torah. So if that's the case, then how do you sequence? How do you choose what mitzvah number one is? Now, I can't give you a comprehensive theory for how the Rambam does that in all 613 mitzvahs. But what I can tell you is, if you look at the top 10, if you look at the first 10 mitzvahs, which we will do in a moment at source number 12, they do seem to be more than just another mitzvah. And again, I always hesitate to use the term another mitzvah. Every single mitzvah is of infinite spiritual value and sanctity. But these mitzvahs almost seem to have a special status within the pantheon of 613 mitzvahs. So what do I mean by that? Look at source number 12. Mitzvah harishona. What is the first mitzvah? Sometimes in Mishnah Torah, we spoke about this 2 years ago, the Rambam doesn't use the word laha'amin, but lada'as, to know that there is a God. And we also noted the fact then that not everybody counts this as a mitzvah. According to the Bahag, it's almost so foundational that it is not a mitzvah, it's the foundation upon which all the other mitzvahs are built. But the Rambam says the first mitzvah is belief in God. Now again, did the Rambam pull that out of a hat and just randomly decide that's going to be the first mitzvah? Presumably not. The Rambam picked that because it is indeed the foundation upon which everything else is built. So that's mitzvah number one. What's mitzvah number two? Second line of source number 12. Now mitzvah hashniya, believing in the oneness of Hashem. No polytheism, no multiple gods, divine simplicity, which for the Rambam, again, is a whole philosophical concept, but there's only one God. That is number two. So first is belief in God himself. Number two, belief in the unity, the simplicity, certainly the fact that there are no other gods. There's a single God. Again, very, very foundational to monotheistic belief. If the first part is theistic belief, the second part is the monotheistic belief. So you have those as the first two mitzvahs. Number three, mitzvah shlishis, ahavas Hashem, mitzvah of loving Hashem. Again, this is not just something that you do once a year. Again, eating matzah is amazing on the night of the Seder, but these are things that are really, again, the substance and foundation of all that we believe and all that we do in our religious experience. Ahavas Hashem. And if number three is Ahavas Hashem, you could probably guess what is number four going to be? What's it going to be? Yiras Hashem. Mitzvah haraviyas, fourth line of source number 12. Just like we have these two phenomena, we have this love of Hashem and fear of Hashem. According to some, those are two phenomena that are in tension with each other. According to the Rambam, those are actually two sides of the same coin. When you properly understand what Ahava and Yira refers to, for the Rambam, those are two sides of the same coin, as he expresses in the second paragraph of the Torah. So you have belief in Hashem, monotheistic belief, he is one. Loving Hashem, fearing Hashem. Let's go to number 5. Mitzvah chamishas, that is the mitzvah to serve Hashem. How do we serve Hashem? What's the Rambam say this mitzvah is? Does anyone know? According to the Rambam, la'ovdo refers to avoda shehi balev, which is worship of the heart, which is tefillah. This is where the Rambam counts prayer as a mitzvah midoraisa. We were mentioning instances where the Ramban critiques the Rambam for including certain things in the Sefer HaMitzvos. This is a very famous instance where the Ramban disagrees and argues that prayer is not a biblical mitzvah. It is not a mitzvah midoraisa. He argues that in most circumstances it is a rabbinic mitzvah, maybe exclusively in makom tsa'ar, in a place of real distress. Maybe then it's midoraisa, but ordinarily it's not. But the Rambam counts it serving Hashem, mitzvah number 5. HaMitzvah hashishis. Now, the way the Rambam formulates this mitzvah is somewhat interesting, and I don't want to delve into that right now. But he says the mitzvah is to cling to Talmidei Chachamim and to spend time with them and to learn in their yeshivos, etc., etc. Lidabek im hachachamim is a reference to what mitzvah? Deveikus b'Hashem, clinging to Hashem. The Gemara says you obviously can't cling to Hashem. God is non-corporeal. So how do you cling to Hashem? You cling to His representatives. So this is the mitzvah of deveikus b'Hashem, clinging to Hashem. So far we have belief in God, monotheistic belief, loving Hashem, fearing Hashem, serving Hashem, clinging to Hashem. And then what's number 7 on this illustrious list of top 10 mitzvahs foundational to everything we believe? Bold of source number 12. Mitzvah hashviyas hishetzivanu lihishava b'shmo yis'ala. It is the mitzvah to take a shvuah in the name of Hashem. That's mitzvah number 7. You go down the list. Number 8, lihidamosbo v'halachta b'drachav, to try to be like Hashem, what we call in Latin imitatio Dei. It's a thing. That's a Latin expression that many of us non-Latin speakers know of. Imitatio, like trying to imitate the character traits, if we can describe them as such, of Hashem. The 9th mitzvah is Kiddush Hashem, L'Kadesh Hashem, Kiddush Hashem. And number 10th, rounding out the top 10, is Kriya Shema, the calling cry, the banner of the Jewish people for thousands of years. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That is number 10. You look at this list, and one of these things is not like the others. Again, if I were constructing my top 10 here, I probably definitely would have included, I'd say, at least 7 or 8 of them intuitively for my top 10. Again, once Kriya Shema is included, I could have made a case for that also, a pretty strong case for that. You know, when you consider Kriya Shema, the role that it plays, the outsized role that it plays in the life of the Jewish people. You know, all 9 out of the 10 really make great intuitive sense. And for number 7, the Rambam includes what? Swearing in the name of Hashem. And the truth is, as strange as that is, if you turn back for a moment to source number 3, the Rambam is really just doing a careful read of the psukim themselves, as the Medrash did in source number 5, but in a slightly different way. The Rambam is always very, very sensitive to the formulations of Torah Shebechsav. In general, the relationship between Torah Shebechsav, the relationship between Tanakh and Torah Sheba'al Peh and the Halacha, is an interesting one that different great Jewish thinkers took in different ways. Some felt that they're really 2 different disciplines. Formulations of Torah Shebechsav are great for Chumash class. When you're in Gemara class, they don't carry as much weight. Others felt that the formulations of Torah Shebechsav very much inform the substance and character of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the Rambam, in many instances, is very, very sensitive to the formulations of Torah Shebechsav. Let's just go back to that pasuk for a second. Source number 3. Ez Hashem Elokecha tira, fear Hashem. Oso savod, serve Hashem. Uvosid ba, cling to Hashem. So far, this is a super inspiring pasuk. And what is the grand crescendo? What is the climax of the pasuk? Uvishmo tishaveya. And by the way, when you're taking an oath because you have a monetary dispute in court, make sure that you take that oath in the name of Hashem. It's a rather disappointing end to the pasuk. It's a dramatic letdown. You have this buildup from fearing Hashem, serving Hashem, clinging to Hashem, and then swearing in His name. What exactly is the Torah trying to communicate? And that's exactly what the Rambam is picking up on when he includes this within the framework of all those broader foundational mitzvahs. And of course, it forces us to ask why. Fortunately for us, the Rambam does give us a clue. And this brings us to sources number 13 and 14. Let's take a look back at the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, Mitzvahs Aseh Zayin, in full. We'll look at the fuller text. We're not going to read all of it, but we'll read much of it in source number 13. The Rambam's description in source number 14, and then we'll try to create a broader context or describe a broader context for what this mitzvah is truly all about. Source number 13. Mitzvah Hashaviyas, the 7th mitzvah. That we saw already. The mitzvah is to swear in the name of Hashem when you have a need to affirm something, or alternately a need to deny something. But then the Rambam says as follows, first bold of source number 13. Ki bezeh hagedula lashem yis'aleh, the kavod ve'iloi. Because by doing so, you are engaged in great praise, kavod ve'iloi, praise, elevation. You're bringing grandeur to God's name when you do so. Don't think, the Rambam says, this is just a pragmatic declaration in order to get you out of a monetary obligation, in order to try to resolve a dispute. When you assert that truth, or your truth assertions, are rooted in Hashem, the source of all truth, that is a great sanctification of his name. Continues the Rambam, who omra uvishmoti shaveya. What's the pasuk that we've been focused on tonight? Uvishmoti shaveya. Ubebeir amru amra Torah hishava b'shmo v'amra Torah al tisha. And he says, if you look at the Gemara in Shavuos, we have these two mitzvos, sometimes to swear, sometimes not to swear. Second bold of source number 13. Rotze lomar, what does this mean to say? Ki kemo hashavua she'ena tzricha ata muzhar mimena, hi mitzvos lo sa'aseh, just like you are commanded not to take an untruthful oath, or an oath that is in vain, and that is a lo sa'aseh, and as we saw at the very outset, it's not just a lo sa'aseh, it's one of the Aseret HaDibrot, and it is particularly severe and strict, as we saw in the Gemara Shavuos. Fourth line of source number 13. Kain hashvua be'es hatzorech mitzvah ba, v'hi mitzvahs aseh. Says the Rambam, the flip side of that the opposite side of the same coin, is that when there is a legitimate need and you are speaking the truth, there is a great mitzvah in taking a shvuah. The Rambam says the severity of the lo sa'aseh is the exact flip side of the greatness of the mitzvahs aseh. They are, again, two sides of the same coin. They're opposites. It's not just that it's a severe prohibition. The severe prohibition demonstrates that when properly done, you're actually doing something that is commensurately or inversely great. As bad as it is to do an improper shvuah, so it is great to do a proper shvuah. He then adds, we're not going to read this whole passage, etc., etc. He says, that is why you can only swear in the name of Hashem and not in the name of anything else. He says you can't swear in the name of the malachim. The malachim are very holy, they're sacred. But are they the anchor, the source, the foundation of all truth in the world? No, they are not. They are just an outgrowth of the truth with a capital T, the real source of all truth, which is the Borei Olam, which is the creator, which is Hashem. Only in his name can you swear. Let's just skip down to the final bold passage of source number 13. And this is what the pasuk meant when it said, swear in his name. Recognize that the only source of truth in the world comes from Hashem. He is the only one for whom it is worthy to swear in his name, because all truth emanates from him and from him only. Rambam makes a very similar point in the 11th chapter of Hilchos Shavuos in his Mishnah Torah. If you look at source number 14, again, we'll read the bold quickly. Just like taking an unnecessary oath, an untruthful oath, is a prohibition. Again, the Rambam highlights this again parallel, or the way in which they're opposites in one way, but they're two sides of the same coin in another. This is just like it is a prohibition to take an improper oath, so too it is a mitzvah to take a proper oath. He quotes the pasuk. And then second bold passage of 14. The Rambam says, if you want the proper path to avodas Hashem, to service of Hashem, one of the ways of doing so is taking an oath. V'kiddush gadol hu b'yishava b'shmo. It is a great splendor and praise to his name if you take an oath in his name. And then the Rambam directly follows that in halacha beis, v'asur l'yishava b'davar achar im shemo, and you can't include anything else. Again, you can't include the malachim, you can't include the gedolim, you can't include tzaddikim, talmidei chachamim. It doesn't matter how noble the person or persons you are including in the shvuah is. Nothing can be included in the shvuah but the name of Hashem. Final bold passage of 14. Anyone who joins anything else with the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, with the best of intentions, not chas v'shalom avodah zarah. They include Moshe, Aaron, David, and Shlomo. If they do so, ne'ekar min ha'olam. You are uprooted from the world, as it were. Or in other words, you're flipping the world's values on its head. The only person in whom, the only entity in whom we root truth is the Ribono Shel Olam himself. The way the Rambam is understanding this pasuk is as a statement about the very foundation of all our beliefs, just like all the other mitzvos that surround it. When you take a shvuah in the name of Hashem, yes, if you do it flippantly, A, the Gemara says that's deeply problematic, and B, you're not really understanding what you are doing or what you are engaged in. When people take all sorts of I swear on the name of X, Y, or Z. Again, they're very often doing it in a flippant manner that's not really reflecting the gravity of what they're doing. The Rambam says you are making a theological statement every time you take a shvuah about what the source of the very concept of truth is, what all truth in this world is based on, about where it comes from, what its source is. And every time you do so, you are stating that it comes from the Borei Olam and the Borei Olam alone, only the Ribono Shel Olam. And that really can go back to some of the other issues that we were discussing before as well in terms of the Gemara. It could be that's why it is so severe if you fail to properly properly swear in the name of Hashem, and why it's considered such a severe violation in instances where you do so either untruthfully or in vain. The Gemara said the entire world is punished when you do so. Why is the entire world punished for a person's sin? I would suggest, this could be a drash on the Gemara, this is my own take. It's not that Hashem is punishing us in some kind of like culpable way. You're all culpable for the fact that you took a shvuah the wrong way. When you undermine the source of truth, there are ramifications. There is a ripple effect for all the people around you and for the entire world around you. So everybody is punished not because Hashem is holding everyone responsible for one person's sin. What the Gemara is telling us is, when you do that, don't think it's just, again, something that I uttered independently, quietly. It doesn't impact anyone else. When you undermine the values of basic truth and falsehood, and you tend to disintegrate those categories and try to attribute them to something other than Hashem, the entire world suffers as a result of that corrosion of the concept of truth. The pasuk that was used at the end was the pasuk that was used by Dasan and Abiram after the Korach insurrection. The Korach insurrection was all about Ki chol ha'eda kulam kedoshim. Everyone is sanctified. Everybody should be able, in a sense, to come up with their own truth. Everybody has sanctity within them. Who are you, Moshe, to kind of dictate to us what the laws of truth and falsehood are, what the rules of right and wrong are, what's spiritually correct, what's spiritually incorrect? Who are you to do so? Democratize the process. So when a person does not properly appreciate a shvuah, we say, they are embodying the ethos of the Korach insurrection, of really, again, undermining the source of all truth in the world. And perhaps that is why it is included in the Aseret HaDibrot, because it is a theological statement about the Ribono Shel Olam as the source of all truth. And if we take that approach, I think it is actually even more acute and more relevant in the world that we live in today. The notion of God as the source of truth has been under assault for a very long time. But more recently, the notion of truth itself has come under assault. For intellectual historians, and I'm not an intellectual historian, this is my own armchair intellectual history, but this started largely in the post-war era in the 1950s, French existentialism. You had figures like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the like, denying the notion of right and wrong. Again, there was so much upheaval in the 1940s about basic conceptions of humanity, of civilization, right? It was the Holocaust, and then there was World War II. The whole notion of right and wrong and morality and immorality, just everything people were trying to just contend with, everything that had just happened. And you had these schools of intellectual thought that began to assault the notion of truth, values, principles. Existentialism effectively asserts, at least again, you take Camus or Sartre's existentialism, that we're here, we exist, and that's it. There's no meaning to it. It's kind of like a nihilistic ethic. There's no meaning to it. There's no purpose behind it. People ask, what's the meaning of life? The answer is that there is no meaning of life. We're here. Do what you want. It is what it is. Make what you want of it. It could be depressing to some. It could be liberating to others. But that's all that we have. There is no truth. And that went further into the realms of what we call postmodern thought, whereby, again, the notion of truth came under assault. Everything was personal truth. What is my truth as opposed to your truth? So the whole notion of truth was subjectivized as opposed to being rooted in something objective. It's kind of like an extreme version of the Korach argument. Who is the arbiter of objective truth? Each of us has our own truths that we hold dear. And recently that's exploded in the social media era. If you, again, originally that was just an intellectual idea reserved for the intellectual elites in their ivory towers. But now in the era of social media, where we're kind of all fed the truths that we want to believe and that we are told to believe, or that we seek out and we want to believe, it's, again, the whole notion of objective truth. No one knows what to believe. No one knows what's up, what's down, what's right, what's left, what's black, what's white. There's whole notion of truth has come under a radical assault. And that's why it's really critical to reassert that for us and for the world, but we recognize the truth that there is truth, and the Ribono Shel Olam is the source of it. I'll give you one story that really kind of, to me, reflects it in a very personal way, because it was a story that involved me and one of my students. I used to teach when I was teaching in North Shore. I used to teach a 12th grade course called Jewish Philosophy. It was a course that I myself had crafted, largely based on the students that I had. It was actually started by the students, to give them credit. I had a group of students, they were 11th graders, and they were really interested in the bigger questions about Judaism. Not the kids that were sitting in the base medrash learning. This was actually dafka, mostly not the kids who were sitting in the base medrash learning. And they had questions about the larger things of Judaism that had never been taught. They were learning Tanakh, they were learning Gemara, but they never learned theology, Jewish philosophy, and they were very interested in it. So they started a club. They called it the Socratic Society, which is like the most pretentious and nerdy name ever, but that's what they called it. They thought it was cool, so I just went with it. And we used to meet during lunch, and we used to talk about these broader questions once a week. And they said, you know what, once a week is not enough. Why don't we turn it into a class? They petitioned the principal. They turned it into a class, and I crafted a curriculum based on many of the questions that I had been receiving. And I always tried to create like a very conversational, seminar-like class where everyone was free to express their opinion. I had one student. It was not in my first cohort. It was my second or third. We'll call her Sarah, who one day, in the context of a discussion, said, Rabbi, I personally find nihilistic thought very appealing. I identify as a nihilist. I identify as an atheist. I don't believe in any of this stuff. Like, I think we exist. We're here. She was identifying, again, she was subscribing to a particular form of atheism that's called naturalism, which I think for most street atheists, if you will, is probably what they assume atheism is. It's a particular brand of atheism, which is the most popular, but far from the most intellectually sophisticated. And she was saying that I don't believe I'm nihilistic. So again, in this context, I said, everyone here is welcome. Like, there's no judgment in this room. I obviously don't agree. I wouldn't have devoted my life to being a rabbi if I did agree. But fine. Class continues, and at some point later, I don't even remember when, she was telling me about how she's very passionate about human rights. And she's very passionate about some certain, causes that you could identify as maybe liberal, maybe leftist, or maybe there was overlap in those instances between the two, causes that she felt her community was falling short on. She came from a very politically conservative community, and that was part of her tension with Jewish life in general. And she said, I'm very, very passionate about human rights, and I think the community falls short on that front. So I said to her, Sarah, I very much appreciate your moral impulse and your moral drive, but I do have to clarify something for you. You can't really believe in human rights. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, if you're a nihilist, you can't really believe in human rights at the same time. Nihilist means we're just here. There's no such thing as rights. The whole notion of rights doesn't exist. It's not a physical entity. I can't point to rights. I can't hold rights. The most you could say is, it makes me feel good when other people are treated nicely. But you can't say there's any kind of moral framework or moral truth for human rights or for treating other people well. If you're a nihilist, it's got to be one or the other. You believe in human rights, that humans possess certain rights to dignity, to respect, to basic care and well-being, or you believe this is all random. And hey, go do your thing. And again, you can still advocate for human rights by saying it makes me feel good when other people are treated well, but that's not really a right. It doesn't really exist. And she really took it to heart. She really pondered that for a while. And she again, it was a conversation, we had a very close relationship. We really talked that out for a long time. And I remember sharing, and I've shared this here also, I think maybe perhaps in our first series on Amunah, I remember sharing with her that one of the strongest reasons for my belief is the notion of moral truth. It is very hard to justify moral truths if you don't believe in some form of God. It's not impossible. Certainly if you're a naturalist, which is that, again, popular form of atheism that I described before, it is very, very difficult to argue for moral truth. You can argue that it makes us feel good. You can argue that it helps in creating a functioning society. You can argue that it's a byproduct of evolution. There are all sorts of arguments that you can make, but it's very, very hard to make an actual argument for moral truth unless you have something higher, unless you have something greater. And if you are a moral person who believes with deep conviction that morality is not just a personal preference, or it's not just a function of how a society works well because of evolution, but you believe there's real truth to the matter, capital T, then that really serves as a very powerful motivator for belief, a very powerful reason to believe in emunas elokus, ubishmo tisha v'ya, and on the flip side, lo siksa Hashem Hashem elokach l'shav, are some of the most powerful arguments for belief, and certainly the belief system, the beliefs of rights and wrongs and do's and don'ts that form the substance and core of our religious lives. I can tell you that by the end of that year, again, this was a very long conversation. She told me that, Rabbi, after this class, I can tell you that I believe. And I don't know if she was ever observing Torah mitzvahs. I don't know where she is now. We unfortunately did not keep in touch. But by pondering those concepts of truth, of moral truth, of how to properly live one's life, and again, the truth with a capital T, as I've been saying, that reflects and what it's all anchored in and what's its core and substance, she was led on a path to Emunah. From the third of the Aseret HaDibrot, she worked her way back to the first of the Aseret HaDibrot because of the truth that is entailed when we assert that all truth is rooted in Hashem. So perhaps that is why the third of the Aseret HaDibrot is not just an utterance of declaring the Lord's name in vain, but is actually a very fundamental pillar and foundation of all our belief. And Be'ez Hashem, over the coming weeks, we'll explore some of the ramifications of that in our own lives.